Afternoon, everyone. We are just at the top of the hour and we're going to get started. Thank you for those of you who are rejoining us from earlier, and for anyone who's new on the conference site, welcome. Before we get started, I'm so excited to introduce our speaker, but before we get started, I just wanted to cover a couple of ground rules. We are somewhat subject to our technology and do have storms going on in the area. So please, if for some reason there's a hiccup, we'll be back with you as soon as possible. But we have to kind of account for that. And we are so excited about this conference, just as an opportunity to network and engage and interact with each other. If you have questions as we're going throughout the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A section. We have people from all different levels of organizations attending, so no question is a silly question. We want them all, and we really just want to learn and understand from each other. So now I would like to introduce Prianka Murthy. Very excited to have her here with us today, and she'll be talking with us about socializing research. Priyanka, I'll let you give your own introduction.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much. Should I share my screen?
Yes, please. I'm going to stop sharing.
All right. There we go. Can everyone see that? Or Barbara, can you see that?
Hasn't come through just quite yet. There we go. It says socializing insights to maximize impact.
Oh, good. Awesome. Okay, so yeah, I'll be talking about socializing insights to maximize impact today. And I'm also dealing with some technical issues, so bear with me. All right, so a little bit about me and why I'm talking about this today. So I used to work in academia. Now I am a UX researcher, so I've worked in both qualitative, quantitative research, a lot of different areas where we talk about impact in a lot of different ways. So now that I work in UX, I've had the pleasure of working across industries, which has allowed me to kind of think more about impact in a variety of different company settings. So I've worked, in industrial design, mental health, finance, a lot of really different areas. But it's allowed me to kind of think about how we measure and quantify impact in different settings. So I think every company and industry approaches it differently, but also there are a lot of similarities and themes that we can kind of learn from and share. And I think in meeting with lots of different researchers, I think I've spent a lot of time talking about how we measure impact, but also a lot of time talking about how our insights are, ignored or put on a shelf somewhere. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I don't know if I'll ever stop thinking about impact, but it's definitely something that I am starting to kind of shift how I approach it and the ways that I'm trying to maximize impact. So I'm talking about socializing impact today, but what does that really mean? I think that's really obvious to some of you. Yeah, we're reading out our insights. Those are our insights, and that's how we maximize impact. But I think maximizing impact can often involve engaging in a larger socialization strategy to accompany those insights. So often reading out your insights is kind of the first step, but we have a lot of other ways that we can work on socializing our insights more broadly to make sure that our impact is seen a little bit stronger and has like a larger outcome. So we start at, you finished a big research project. Congratulations. I know we do these giant research projects and it feels like a huge weight is lifted off our shoulders. And you have a big report that you are going to deliver to your key stakeholders. Amazing. You've done your work, but what comes next? I think for a lot of us, it's on to the next project, on to the next whatever we're doing. But the reality is a lot of us work in contexts where, stakeholders might not necessarily believe in the value of research, or research gets put on the back burner. And we are struggling to, my thing just put out. Okay. Yeah, so you're struggling to, talk with your stakeholders about why we need to do UX, and sometimes it gets put on the back burner in favor of development. I think probably all of us can count on, I don't even think we could count how many times I've been told, okay, like we're not doing research, we're going straight to development. And when research does occur, it maybe doesn't feel so impactful because our insights aren't being incorporated. So we're seeing our research kind of be put on a shelf somewhere. And the reality is sometimes that presentation to your stakeholders is just a small piece of your larger socialization process. So reading out insights to your stakeholders might not be enough, and you may not start to think about how that fits in as just one small puzzle piece into kind of a larger, broader process. So I've started to kind of think about socialization in terms of tactical and strategic research. So if you listen to Jared Spool, and I think you're probably familiar with tactical versus strategic research. So tactical being, are we building the product right for our users? So this is, I think, easier to get buy-in for in most of our organizations because those are the projects that have really clear, measurable impact. There's a clear problem that we're trying to solve. We have a clear methodology, and it generates a very clear business value. So, dollar signs for our business stakeholders. But strategic is a little bit more about, are we even answering the right questions? So more about the holistic user experience, long-term strategy that you might not be able to necessarily measure the impact immediately, and it's not so clear what the impact is immediately, but there's longer term, larger impact that can drastically shift the product strategy of your company and the way that your users engage with your product. And I think in one of his presentations, Jared Spool was talking about, we should be doing 85% strategic work and 15% tactical. I think some of you might be doing that in your companies, and that's great. Especially, like big tech companies like Google that have like thousands of researchers that are able to kind of engage in these different areas. But for a lot of us, we don't have the bandwidth to be doing such a large amount of strategic research. We don't have the buy-in. I think most stakeholders don't really want to invest in research where there isn't really clear immediate impact. I think there's very much a short-term look on UX. And so they want to see like, we're doing this research and it has this immediate impact, move on to the next. But we need to start being able to move the needle towards being able to have that larger, longer term outlook. So I think socialization is a key part of that. And that can help kind of drive your UX maturity towards strategic research because it builds our credibility, it builds our brand as UX, people know who we are. We're so much more likely to get buy-in for a project that no one really understands the value of if they know who you are, know what you do, know that you bring impact to your company, and are able to trust that strategic work will uncover some larger insights down the line. So I've also started to think about socialization in a similar framework that I hope is a little bit easier to think about since I've kind of mapped it onto a similar framework. I think there are a lot of ways to think about socialization, but I separate it into, once again, tactical versus strategic. So tactical socialization to me is very much that project-based reactionary socialization. So tied to specific projects, you have a really specific audience, you've been requested by your stakeholders to conduct this really specific research, and the insights are read out to a very specific set of stakeholders who are invested in the outcome of this research. So this is a reaction to, your stakeholders have asked for something, you're giving it back to them. Strategic, I think, is a lot more longer term. This is socialization that might look at longer term objectives of your research and kind of the longer term strategy of UX. For example, if you do 10 different research projects in a year on the same set of users, can you pull out larger insights and themes across those projects to, give out to a larger audience? Can you maybe meet with broader audiences? Can you see where there are endpoints for you to meet with new people who haven't been exposed to your work? I think strategic tries to think of the longer term, like, okay, this isn't necessarily related to our project, but how can we expand our brand? How can we make sure that we're reaching new people? And I often like to think of socialization as fixing what I see as a bottleneck in our process. So oftentimes we do our research, we're delivering our insights, and then your stakeholders are like, great, I actually don't care about this. And it gets put on a shelf somewhere. And then 2 years later, someone asks, okay, didn't we do research on that product like 2 years ago? And you're like, yes, I did. I put a lot of work and effort into that and it wasn't implemented and we're revisiting it. So that costs a lot of money for the business in general because it costed your time, it costed the everyone who's working on that product time. So often we deliver those insights and they just sit on a shelf somewhere. And socialization can help make sure that we're getting widespread buy-in for our insights and make sure that our stakeholders are involved in our insights and that they're much more likely to feel engaged with it and much more likely to make sure that they're invested in the implementation of it. Okay, so how do we effectively socialize for impact? So where do we start with all of this? I think obviously, we start with our reading out to our main group of stakeholders. And I put together this little plot diagram. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is like the plot of a story. You have your beginning, you have rising action, the climax, falling action, and then a conclusion. And I think the way that you tell a story about your insights has to be similar. You want a concise story that has the goal. So what was the initial problem that led you to do your research? What was the negative impact that it was having? And you want it to be something that pulls in your audience. So you have your problem, but you're presenting it in a way that's relatable, it's personable. What were your blockers? What was standing in your way? How did you execute it? So you got through your blockers. What did you do? How did you end up doing the research? What were the insights that you found? And then what are you recommending? So I think making sure that you're telling this really concisely, but also making sure you have all these key points and creative data visuals, revealing quotes, all that stuff that makes a story engaging. And I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned in my career is that you have to let your audience define your format. So I think this is something we all kind of know. And it's something I knew coming in, I think in a theoretical sense, like, yeah, of course, I know who I'm reading out to. I want to make sure that I am developing a presentation that engages them. But I think it also will kind of tell you what point of the process you're engaging them in. So for example, if you're reading out to a really high UX maturity, high research buy-in group, such as tech stakeholders who love working with you, they know what you do, they're really bought in, you're going to give them the full gamut. You have your presentation with all the technical, nitty gritty, nerdy research stuff. They all love it. The crowd goes wild. But then you might also be in situations where you're meeting with stakeholders who haven't really worked with you. They don't really know a lot about UX. They don't have buy-in for research. They mostly see it as a waste of time and money. And this might be a situation where you have a much more interactive presentation. I mean, obviously, presentation should be interactive, but it's more interactive. And you might honestly wait until you have a prototype and design has been engaged and you're much further along in the process. So you have that story of, hey, like, we did all this research. This is what we found. These were our recommendations. This is how it played out. And I think this is something I've learned the hard way a few different times where, you want your research to stand on its own and it can be disappointing when it doesn't, but it's a stepping stone. You wait until the end of the process so they can see the full story so that they understand, okay, wait, this goes back to the research and we got here because of all that research that we did. And I think that is like a big proving value point. And I think one big thing is that you want to make sure, if you can, involve your stakeholders in your research. So keeping your stakeholders updated on progress, I think that's a bare minimum thing that you do. You start your research, you tell them you're doing it, maybe they sit in on some sessions, but also maybe they can be part of the analysis. Can they be doing debriefs with you? Can you do workshops with them and get a little bit more about their takes, doing stakeholder workshops? That helps them feel more invested in the process. And then therefore, when you're reading out your insights and your findings, they're bought on because they were there when you came to that conclusion. I put a quote that I thought was really funny, but also telling from a previous job where I did a workshop with some of our stakeholders. We didn't have time to talk with users for a really long time. So we were going to do a proto persona workshop where we were, defining users among like really different stakeholders who had kind of a piecemeal understanding of users, put together some proto personas, and then do some validation with users. And we pulled all these stakeholders in a room together, and I asked for everyone to email me a quick takeaway from their workshop because we ran over time. And one of the PMs, I put like a little stock photo here, but he said, I honestly thought this workshop would be a waste of my time, but I learned so much from everyone else in the room and was able to articulate a more accurate picture of the user. Honestly, I was a little offended at first because he said that he thought it would be a waste of my time, but I honestly think a lot of stakeholders feel that way about research. They don't really think that there's a point to it because they know their users, they know what they want. Like, let's just go to design and go to development, whatever. But realizing that their understanding of what's happening is not the truth is a huge thing to reveal to your stakeholders, and to see that other people have different models in their mind of the users and the research that's being done is really, really valuable. And one big thing that I always recommend is finding your UX champions. So these are folks who, they're the ones who understand the value of UX. So you don't have to have these fights with them about, this is why we do research, this is why we engage UX early and often. They get it. They know how it fits into the product lifecycle. They're engaging you early and consistently, and they're always pushing for UX work when they can. So they evangelize UX when they have the opportunity. They're always advocating for UX. And in general, they're just an ally. And you want to make sure that you're engaging them and seeing, okay, like, where are new avenues that I can move into to, read out my work? Because maybe you have a set group of stakeholders that are invested in the work, but maybe there's another group that you could talk to who would be interested in the type of work that you've done, don't know a lot about, UX, and maybe would benefit from working with you, but you just don't know them. So your UX champions can kind of be that connector for you. So you should be leveraging their network. And using your UX champions. So yeah, leverage your UX champions networks, and then also making sure you set up regular forums to present your work. So I think some companies already have this built in. A lot of companies I've been in don't. So having like research roundtables or lunch and learns or whatever, where people can just kind of sign up and come hear you talk about your research or any like larger thematic findings you have, or even just your regular readout that you already prepared. This can kind of help you socialize your findings with folks that you don't already have direct contact with and who might not really know about UX, but they hear you give your talk and then they kind of go back to their team and say, wait, UX is actually something that we could engage with, and maybe we should be, because they had all these insights that maybe we can be leveraging. And also make sure to disperse your findings over multiple mediums. I was in a talk last week where someone said this, and I thought it was so interesting, where I think often we send emails and it feels like we're sending emails into a void because, like, who is checking their email? But he was talking about, there is that guy who lives and dies by his email. Like, he is checking his email, he's reading them extensively. So there's that guy. Then there's the guy who is watching the recordings, or the person who's showing up to the forums that you've put together, or the person who's religiously reading newsletters. So blasting out your findings through multiple channels helps you maximize that reach. Okay. And it can be a little daunting to think about, okay, like, why am I going out to share my findings with other groups? Like, I kind of want to stay where I know people and stay with the people who are invested in my findings. Move from the inside out. So you start with UX, you're talking to other people who are invested in your research and your product partners, your PMs, whoever, and then see if you can get a little bit more into the tech space. See if you can move out into your business stakeholders. See if there are other people and other ways you can kind of leverage those networks to get word of your work out there. And one of the unfortunate findings that I found is that the biggest impact to your socialization strategy can be networking, which, as an introvert, I hate to say it, but go to the happy hour at work, go to the bowling night or whatever. I know, like, when you shut off at 5, you're like, I don't want to see these people ever again. I don't personally feel that way because I love my coworkers. But I think having those outside relationships with folks can really impact the way that they see you in the business. Like you made a friend in business and you reach out to him at work and you're like, hey, I noticed you're working on this project, like we should involve UX. And he is much more likely to bring you in because he's already your buddy than, some random person reaching out. So having those networks and expanding your reach casually can also impact your work within the company. And like this is something we know, but it needs to be said because I think a lot of times like I go to these things and I'm like, oh, this is networking for my job and for, getting like higher up in the company, but also to be able to do your job more effectively for roles where you need to leverage the people you work with. Okay. So why do we need to invest more time in socialization? This is a lot of effort, especially in roles where we're pressed for time, we're working really hard, we're under-resourced. But I think one of the biggest things is it moves us towards a user-centered approach. So I think we've all been in situations where we have stakeholders who have millions of different objectives and goals. So, you have your business stakeholders and your tech stakeholders and your product stakeholders, and they all want different things and they have different opinions and they don't agree. And it's frustrating because it feels like, okay, we're not actually getting anywhere. So the best socialization strategies can help align, those business goals, those product roadmap items, the tech timelines, whatever, and bring them together and say, okay, like this is what the user actually wants though. And we're increasing empathy for the user and making sure like the product roadmap is built around the right questions and making sure the business goals are aligned with what users actually want and need. And also research is really valuable, no matter how big or small, in the sense that sometimes it feels like you need to be sharing out those really big, impressive types of research that you've done, that you invested a lot of time in. But honestly, even the small tracks of research where you just did, one round of usability testing and you did like one iteration and then it moved to design and it felt like you just did one little thing. That's great because someone somewhere didn't know that something so small and lean could generate value. And that's kind of how you evangelize research within your company. You show we're adaptable. We can roll with the punches. We do all these different types of things. It's not just like months long research. It can be a week-long sprint. It can look so many different ways. And that's how you get buy-in for future research. People see, okay, like UX research and UX design, like they can kind of do a lot of different things. And they've shown that they can generate impact. So maybe we should engage them in this future track. And also, now that you've kind of started socializing through different mediums and channels, now you're getting new engagement areas. Different people in different areas are interested in engaging you for research, but also willing to help you with your research. So I think another point that I've seen in my own work, but someone else formalized this for me well, was that sometimes sales folks, especially in a B2B setting, are the best people to talk to because they can tell you some client insights that they have, especially if you're not really able to talk to clients. Like if your clients are, big hedge funds or like these tiny little companies where there's not enough folks that you can talk to, they can help you and they can be kind of a proxy for your clients. Like obviously this isn't the most ideal situation for research, but they can give you what they know and they're more likely to help you if they think that what you're doing is going to help their clients, because as salespeople, they want their clients to be happy. And so even if your company, you might be in a company where, UX is engaged regularly, there isn't really a need to keep measuring impact or maximizing for impact. But you should still be socializing and you should still have a really robust socialization strategy, because I think every organization I've ever been in has the lowest organizational memory I could ever think of. Like you might be proving your value in 2020, but by 2024, people are forgetting what you bring to the table. You want to make sure that you are building and maintaining credibility. So UX research is one of the first, I don't want to say one of the first, but I mean, I think we've seen so many UX folks getting laid off this year because they're considered a luxury or expendable. So continuing, obviously I'm not saying this will, prevent that, but it helps if you continue to kind of prove that value and you're continuing to show impact, especially as, tech is evolving and we're having so many different technological advancements, showing that UI and UX can impact AI and like how, AI is growing. We're building all these AI experiences, how UX should be the number one thing we're doing with AI experiences. And also continuing to center our users. So making sure that our users are at the center of all new technological initiatives. And finally, collaboration. So we see a lot of differing opinions and goals. So making sure that you're bringing people together and you're fostering kind of cross-functional team collaboration with the user and your empathy for the user that you're investing in. Okay, so after you socialize, what comes next? A few key steps that you want to make sure you're following. So having participants share one key takeaway from your presentation. That's where I got that quote that I said where he thought it was a waste of time, which was honestly a great learning experience for me. So that's how you improve retention of your presentation. If folks know that they need to tell you something afterwards, they're going to listen. And send out an abbreviated version for folks. As much as I, as a nerd, am going to read the 30-page report, and I think that people are going to want to read my 30-page report, no one is reading that report afterwards. I'm sorry. So you are going to be the best off if you just kind of make a little summary, maybe a 2-page summary. It's a little extra work, but with your key points that you want people to take away. And that's how you maximize reach. And making sure that you are consistently pushing out your work in every channel you can find, in every forum. If they don't exist, create your own forums. Consistency is key with this. And lastly, sometimes your readouts maybe don't go the way that you want them to. I think I have been in all of these situations, where you do a readout and your stakeholder says, so what? I knew all of this already. Or there's a lack of interest in the research and you present your findings and they're like, okay, great. Like, where's the prototype? Or no one interacted with you in your presentation. Some people yawned and left early, which I think is rude, but it does happen every once in a while. So what do? If your stakeholder has a so what attitude and thinks that you just validated what they said, but that's exactly it. They had a hunch and you went to the users and you validated that. There's value in that already. Like if their hunch was wrong, then yeah, your value would have been proven. They just happened to be right. And so you validated that and proved that we're in the right direction. If there's lack of interest in research in favor of a prototype, that's okay. Go to the prototype and show how your work impacted that and was a direct line towards how we got to the prototype. And if no one interacted with you in your presentation, that's okay. Sometimes it happens and then you learn from it. Maybe your presentation wasn't as engaging as you thought, or maybe it was after lunch and people are really tired and that happens. But all in all, this is kind of the way that I've started to think about, how are we making sure that we can move the needle a little bit and make sure, and it feels like this really long, arduous process, but once you get the ball rolling and people are starting to understand like, okay, UX is valuable, UX is like the insights that they're having are really impactful. This does slow down and you don't need to be working so hard and pushing so hard for all of this. And I think that's kind of what makes it all worth it. Okay, that was it. And I will stop sharing.
Okay, feel free to put questions in the Q&A section. I have a quick question. Could you give an example of when you said you socialize across multiple mediums, like could you give an example from a project of like more tactically, what were some of the mediums that you were able to utilize to socialize the results?
Yeah, definitely. So I used to work in a pretty small industrial design firm, but the sections were really siloed. So we would meet with our stakeholders, and we would meet with mainly just, the stakeholders and the client. And we would just kind of pass off findings to our design partners, and there wasn't really a lot of communication there. And so I think something that was really helpful was developing a company-wide newsletter and saying, hey, these are our updates from research. This is what we're finding from users, especially because we had certain segments of users that we worked with more often. So just kind of having rolling insights going was really helpful. And I think a lot of people learned something from it. I hope. But, and also planning like that kind of lunch and learn situation where you maybe like once a week, people just bring lunch and you talk a little bit about, this is what we did, this is what we're learning, especially for projects that everyone's invested in, but they maybe don't have a direct line to you, so they can ask their own questions and they can learn a little bit about what's happening in research, things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. How would you measure oh, sorry, read that wrong. Um, what are your thoughts on customizing the readout per stakeholder? Is it worth the effort? Like you said, consistency is key, but what about customization?
Right. I think per stakeholder is hard, especially if you have many different stakeholders. I think generally, I would assume you have like a one key stakeholder group and then like other stakeholders who are kind of tangential. So I think the best approach is to divide it based on who are kind of, I think there's like a matrix for this, but like who are kind of the high impact stakeholders and who are your lower, more tangential stakeholders who are still connectors in your space, and making sure you're targeting for those folks who have like high impact, high reach, and making sure that your insights are most visible and impact and implementable for them, and that you're targeting towards those folks versus the other. I think if you're trying to customize for everyone, you're going to spend maybe like hours just sitting in your computer making different forms of your readout. So making sure that you're prioritizing the stakeholders who you think will have the most impact and the most say in what is being implemented, I think is the best approach.
Okay. And how do you engage stakeholders early on in the process? You mentioned like workshopping at the end when you're like reading out results and stuff like that, but how do you get them to come on board early on, especially those naysayers?
Right. I think the biggest thing for me, especially if you have a lot of naysayers who are those key high impact stakeholders who are kind of the decision makers in the space, propose the leanest research that you can get away with, honestly. And I think because when you go into the meeting and you're saying, hey, I want to do this 2 months long generative research track where we're having hour-long in-depth user interviews, a lot of stakeholders are not going to like that because they think it's a waste of time and they want to see impacts like tomorrow. And so I think for the naysayers, making it clear that this is lean, these are like, it's really clear what our goals are, what we're doing, it has a really defined timeline. Like it's more that tactical approach. And also making sure, yeah, they're engaged from the beginning. So maybe at the beginning, you're doing a stakeholder workshop to kind of understand what are their main goals, what are they trying to achieve, what are they hoping to accomplish and get out of this, and then keeping them in the loop throughout your whole research process. So they're invited to all the interviews. There's a midpoint where you get to debrief and discuss, okay, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're finding, and making sure they're kind of continually in the loop so that they are not surprised at the end. I think that's the biggest failing point, is that if your stakeholders are absolutely shocked by your findings, that's not what you want. That's not the outcome you're looking for. And that's probably where you're going to find the most tension and disagreement. So that early involvement, and then, yeah, just keep making sure that they know what's happening and they're on board with everything you're doing.
Another question we have, when your company is the supplier of marketing research, the research on the shelf is even worse. Is there a path to avoid these cases?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So when your company is like a market research supplier, that whole idea of research sits on a shelf is like
Yeah,
even more daunting, right? So is there a path to avoid research sitting on a shelf?
right. Yeah, I think with research sitting on the shelf, especially if you're supplying market research, I think that, yeah, that feels like a high tension and more stressful. I think my biggest advice for that is if you're, not feeling like your research is being taken or implemented, I think at the beginning before you're conducting the market research is like making sure that you have the engagement that you want so that you're not engaging in research that is not going to be taken into account, and then following up consistently. But at the end of the day, sometimes it just doesn't get implemented. And I think maybe doing kind of like a follow-up and understanding like what was the dissatisfaction, why wasn't it taken into account, so that you can kind of learn from that and adjust for the future, so that you also understand what their goals were and how there wasn't an alignment there, I think is a key point.
Okay, thank you. Next question. At what point would you build in different entitlements for different stakeholders based on information each stakeholder is supposed to see?
Different entitlements for different stakeholders. I mean, I think kind of going back to this like matrix of which stakeholders are the most important, which stakeholders should have the most visibility, I guess depends on kind of where they sit within your company. So obviously the stakeholders who should be the closest to it and have the most entitlements and visibility should be the folks who are, key decision makers, who have the most impact. And also making sure that they are kind of the folks who have the research buy-in, I think I don't think the folks who have low research buy-in should still be kept in the loop and are incredibly important to be tailoring towards. But I think making sure that you are painting a good picture for them versus the folks who are kind of in it with you and should have full visibility because they're bought in, they're research mature. And I think separating those researchers, those stakeholders out to kind of like who is bought in, who isn't bought in, who has, decision-making privileges, who doesn't, and then kind of plotting that out and making sure that you're kind of making your decisions based on that.
Okay. That was the last question that we had. I'll just pause a moment for anyone else to have the opportunity to jump in and ask a question. Have have learned a lot about socialization and different ways that we can do that. So I really appreciate you taking the time for really helping us understand like the value and the impact and why it's so important. So I don't see any other questions. So I think we are good to adjourn. I want to thank you again for your time and all the work you put into your presentation. It was very insightful. What we will do is we will rejoin at the top of the hour. So feel free to grab a snack, answer some emails, and at the top of the hour, we will start with our next presenter. Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.